cell phone. Well, you know what? I don't want to, my apologies. I didn't want to throw off your meeting. So thank you again. Thank you for allowing me to partner with you and to listen. Obviously, your collaboration, especially like on a year, in a year like this, has been needed, and the unity of your collaboration has been needed like no other time before. We had some challenges with the least way to say it during our legislative session, but obviously we have a lot of work to do. And as many of us have questioned the process around the governor's long-term care, at the home proposal, the home component was glaringly obvious. And as all of us are tackling the horror of COVID and what it's doing in our SNFs and congregate living cares, this can't happen without addressing housing. So we must consider housing as a component of health, and affordable and safe housing in Los Angeles area is simply just unavailable to seniors and people living with disabilities. This was the reality pre-COVID, let alone what's going on now. And the pandemic has highlighted this crisis. So as we're waiting to kind of, learn about the final outcome of the master plan on aging, which is supposed to come out in December, I'm excited today to learn a little bit more about how we're turning Project Room Key into Home Key. And I also want to start brainstorming and opening my door for additional policy discussions relating to and outside of housing, of course. So my committee is open. Liz is always available. I'm always available. And just wanted to say thank you all for joining in and participating and keeping your focus and your eye on the prize. So with that, thank you and look forward to the continued collaboration.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to you and your staff for participating in a lot of our webinars over the last several months, and for always being a voice for us in the legislature. So we really appreciate all of that hard work and your willingness to jump on despite technology and all of its struggles for some of us these days. So thanks again, and we look forward to jumping into the rest of our agenda, and I'm happy to follow up with you on anything after this. So we're going to focus today on Project Room Key. We had a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and jumping off on some of the discussion points around Project Room Key and some of the advocacy that was resulted from folks at the collaborative and others coming together to really address some concerns around access for folks with disabilities. And so we're going to start with an update from Christina Mills on kind of how that advocacy effort worked. And so I will hand it off to Christina Mills, Executive Director for the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers.
Thanks, Athena, and good morning, everybody. TGIF. Please don't forget to stay cool today. It's going to be another relatively hot day, especially in the northern part of the state, but we are excited to hopefully end this week's public safety power shutoff as well. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of the conversation and topic of Project Room Key, which CFILC and so many folks in the collaborative and among the disability and aging communities and organizations are really relatively excited about, to see the administration really prioritizing housing in a way that we've not previously seen, and looking for opportunities, both low-hanging fruit and not so low-hanging fruit, ways to make sure that folks who really are in need of housing, both from the disability and senior communities, have it, as well as other individuals that don't fit within those categories. Project Room Key, as you know, came out of the administration's focus in COVID and making sure that folks maybe get out of the congregate camp type homeless settings that were and have been and continue to grow around California. And the California Foundation for Independent Living Centers did a survey last year, not yesterday, of our membership to see how many of our independent living centers out of the 24 or 22 centers that CFILC represents, how many of our centers are actually serving people with disabilities who are also over the age of 60? And what we found was over 50% of the population of folks with disabilities being served by Centers for Independent Living currently is over the age of 60. So that's important to recognize, and I think somewhere something that we've not typically always talked about, because independent living centers serve people with disabilities of all ages, but given the rapid growth of the aging population in California, that's currently where independent living centers sit, which makes it even more important for us to be collaborating and coordinating with our aging partners. With that said, there were a number of us involved in looking at Project Roomkey as an opportunity to ensure that affordable, accessible housing was something that could happen in a long-term way, even after Project Roomkey was to sunset. However, we were also looking at, was Project Roomkey accessible to people with a variety of different types of disabilities? And I'll use the quote that, Director Kim McCoy-Wade always says, if it's not accessible for everyone, it's not accessible. Or if it doesn't work for everyone, it doesn't work for anyone. And with that in mind, we did some research to figure out which counties were implementing Project Roomkey and which of those counties were also implementing it in a way that was fully accessible for folks with disabilities in the aging community. And we are very fortunate. We've been contracting with June Isaacson-Kales, who's on the line, for most of this year, and will continue to do so in 2021. And June is down in the Los Angeles area, and so is Lisa Cudmer. And sorry, I have a frog in my throat this morning. We decided to take on LA County first as a research opportunity to see if in fact Project Roomkey was being implemented in an accessible way in LA County. And we also partnered with Justice and Aging to make sure that it was accessible to elders, older adults with disabilities as well. And what we found was that there was definitely need for improvement. And while our focus today, and Lisa is going to talk a little bit more specifically about LA and the findings and improvements that have been made as a result of our advocacy, we do want to highlight that we believe and have heard, but have not further looked into the discrimination that may be occurring in other counties as a result of Project Roomkey. And I just want to say that we do find that Project Roomkey is a positive program, and as it transitions into Project Homekey, we think that that is also a very positive move in the right direction for Californians. And we just want to ensure that it is indeed accessible and affordable for those that are in need of it most significantly. So with that said, laying the groundwork for that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to talk specifically about the LA findings and the work that we did down there.
Great, thank you, Christina. Good morning, everybody. I've been working on issues around supportive services and improved systems of care and support for older adults and people with disabilities for a very long time. And I find myself now doing a lot of work supporting people experiencing homelessness or people at risk of homelessness. And it's not a coincidence. All these things are coming together: housing, homelessness, aging, disability. It's all converging for, I think, almost all of us as we face this emergency of homelessness in our state. So what we've learned in LA, I'm going to speak mostly about the lessons we've learned from Project Roomkey so far, specifically around older adults and people with disabilities and access to Project Roomkey. A group of advocates was hearing that the Project Roomkey sites, which are mostly hotels, were not accepting people who needed help with their personal care, meaning showering, bathing, grooming, addressing the kinds of things that maybe IHSS usually provides or personal care attendants provide. So a group of advocates looked into it and found that there was indeed a policy in place that specifically said that people who could not complete these activities of daily living on their own were not eligible for Project Roomkey. And led by the LA Aging Advocacy Coalition, which in itself is a lesson learned. LA has a coalition of over 60 organizations that come together to focus on advocacy for older adults in all sorts of areas, not only housing and healthcare and supportive services, but transportation and equity and poverty. So that coalition raised the issue with the Homeless Services Authority. So that was one lesson learned, is having this coalition in place gave the advocates a unified voice to raise a concern. The second lesson we learned is that having a contractor who's running a site or a housing services agency sign something that says they will comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act is a good start, but it does not translate into equal access. It's imperative to have that, but it doesn't always mean that people understand what that means on the ground. What does access to programs mean if you are complying with the ADA? We think that compliance with the ADA evokes images of grab bars or ramps, which is of course essential for physical access, but we're talking about access to programs. And that has to be baked into policies in a way that is real, that is not, cannot be overlooked by contractors. So that was another lesson we learned, that access needs to be defined and monitored and complied with. So after the group of advocates raised this concern, our local Homeless Services Authority issued a change to that policy and said that people who need support with their activities of daily living will not be discriminated against or excluded from Project Roomkey. That's great. But I know that we come from a lot of counties. In LA County, the waiting list for Project Roomkey has thousands of people on it. The sites themselves are closing. So another lesson learned is to try to identify these things much sooner when we're in an emergency and a crisis like this COVID pandemic, which will happen again. It will happen with fires. It will happen potentially with earthquake. It might happen with another pandemic someday. We have to be aware much sooner that we have to monitor for access across the board for any of these emergency services that pop up. And I know that June Isaacson-Kales is on this call. She's my emergency services guru. I know she's a guru to all of us, but that is a main lesson that we've learned. So one of the solutions that came of this is our Homeless Services Authority contracted with an agency to provide some support around activities of daily living in two Project Roomkey sites. That's good. But other counties did that sooner. San Francisco did that early on. Alameda County released an RFP to do that sooner. So that's another lesson learned, is what is our plan to meet the needs for personal care of people in an emergency situation, in a shelter setting, or an interim housing setting, or in permanent housing once people move to whatever comes next after Roomkey. So that is something that we have learned and we must pay attention to going forward. So another lesson that we've learned is that there are policies in place that can support people experiencing homelessness with meeting their personal care needs. I'm sure Corinne can talk more about this, but the California Department of Social Services has a policy in place that redefined what it means to get IHSS in your own home and expanded that definition, recognizing that people experiencing homelessness are not always going to be in the traditional definition of your own home. And DSS expanded that definition to expand access to services, which is great. But does everyone know about that, and can everyone implement that? And in LA County, our own Department of Social Services issued a policy that expedites access to IHSS for people that are in interim housing settings, which means a homeless shelter or a Project Roomkey site, which is good, but it has been very underutilized, I suspect, because there's just not enough of an awareness that it's out there and people need help navigating those systems. So the policies are a very good start and we appreciate them, but we need to understand they're there, know how to access them, make sure they're being implemented fairly and across the board. So that's another lesson. And then one more lesson is that we know that there are services out there that people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness have available to them, but they might not know how to access them, and the homeless services world might not know how to access them. So it's not always that services don't exist, it's that those connections have not been made. So a best practice that I'd like to share with other counties is that in LA County, there's been a cross-sector convening happening. So the Corporation for Supportive Housing is bringing together aging services providers, disability, community providers and advocates and service providers, the homeless services community, health plans, health care, bringing together people from all of those arenas to learn from each other, to specifically understand what systems and services are in place for older adults at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness. And that kind of cross-denominational, intersectional convening is going to help people access the services that are already out there, but they might not know about. And that's happening in LA County by region. So LA County being a massive beast, it's being carved so that people can form relationships regionally. So we have learned how to potentially increase access to services. And I would say the last thing we really need to think about, and this is a question I pose to you, is are we using the tools we have? Are we using IHSS, independent living centers, home and community-based services, Medi-Cal waivers, Medi-Cal programs? Are we using these things to their maximum, to their utmost, to help people emerge from homelessness, or to help people avoid falling into homelessness or return to homelessness? Are we using these programs to their maximum? Is IHSS, it's this incredible tool we have. Is it structured in the best way possible to support people who could be housed if they had the right kind of personal care in place? Are we using IHSS to its maximum to help older adults who might be at enormous risk of falling into homelessness? And if we aren't, how do we get there? How do we use this program we have and these resources that exist to support people? Because if we don't prevent people from falling into homelessness, we will never dig out. We need to focus on prevention and use the tools that we have and the services that exist and the LTSS that all of you work on every day as homelessness prevention programs. So those are some of the lessons we've learned that this will continue to evolve, and some of the personal care services that are in place in Project Roomkey, we think should follow people as they move into HomeKey to help people as they move to permanent housing retain their independence and live in the community with the supports that are essential to that as part of Project HomeKey. So that would be something that we would hope would be baked into the HomeKey structure, is that personal care attendants are essential to helping people get housed and stay housed. So I will wrap it up there. I know that we will have time for questions at the end of this, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Corinne.
Great, thanks Lisa and Christina. Great kind of overview of how the advocates, were able to come together and, raise some real concerns and hopefully get some lessons learned as we transition to Project Home Key going forward. But I know Corinne is here representing Project Room Key and some of the items that the state has been working on related to that. So we want to thank you for coming. Corinne Buchanan is the Assistant Director of Housing and Homelessness at the California Department of Social Services, and we're lucky to have her here today to provide an overview of some of the intersections they've had while implementing Project Room Key. So thanks, Corinne, and back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Hi, folks. I'm Corinne Buchanan with DSS. I'm really happy to be invited to join you this morning, and want to just start by saying a word of appreciation for the work that you've done and the advocacy that you've done to ensure access across the state. I joined DSS at the beginning of this year, just in time for COVID in February of this year. But although I've only been with DSS for a short time, it's become clear to me that our relationship with advocacy organizations is one of mutual respect and an appreciation for the work that you do on behalf of seniors across the state and individuals with disabilities. So thank you for that work and for pushing California in the right direction. So I can start with sort of a quick overview of our role in Project Room Key and some of the work that's happened to date. We at DSS have led what is a multi-agency effort to stand up these hotels and motels. The work is state supported, but it's been led and implemented at the local level. So we created what you could call sort of like the framework for this work, and we were also responsible for seeking FEMA approval for reimbursement for these resources, which has been really key in our ability as a state to get this work done. But communities have braided all different sorts of funding, both federal funding and state funding and local funding, to be able to make this work happen. I think our ability to make an argument to FEMA to not only provide reimbursement, and FEMA is funding these sites at a 75% cost share. We made the case that we shouldn't just fund hotel stays for people experiencing homelessness who are either positive or exposed and need to do that isolation and quarantine, but that this should also be a protective resource for individuals who are experiencing homelessness that are high risk for medical complications should they become infected. So these are not just isolation quarantine sites. These are sites for people who are high risk that should be made available for the long term. So really pleased that we were able to get FEMA on board with that concept, and that counties have really risen to the occasion and stood up hotels to attempt to meet the needs in their communities. So I think folks probably know that we had set an ambitious goal of securing 15,000 hotel rooms across the state, and within a matter of months had met and exceeded that goal with over 16,000 hotel rooms secured. Currently today, there are around just between probably about at this point, 11,500 people that are currently in Room Key sites. Actually, that's how many rooms are occupied, although we have an average occupancy in rooms of about 1.3 individuals. So almost 15,000 people who are currently being provided safe housing through Project Room Key. I will say that you mentioned, Lisa, that some sites are transitioning to Home Key, so some sites, and I won't be able to speak to all of the details, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions folks might have, because the Home Key piece is the responsibility of the Housing and Community Development Department within the state administration, but we've been working very closely with them on the administration, so I may be able to answer some questions that you might have. But that is a resource that allows cities and counties and tribes to purchase various housing sites that can be made available for people experiencing homelessness, which includes hotels and motels, and even hotels and motels that were a part of Project Room Key. So it's one important tool in our toolkit for ensuring housing stability for people when they exit Project Room Key. And each community has sort of a different calculus in terms of when it's time to start to ramp down some of those sites. And when they do so, it's because they have sufficient access to resources that will allow for permanent housing stability upon exit, whether that's a rapid rehousing intervention or reuniting with family or other loved ones, or whether that's moving into permanent supportive housing. So you can imagine we are really focused on supporting those positive exits to housing. And I appreciate also that you all have brought up the importance of IHSS and making sure that anyone who's linked to continue to push linkage to IHSS in the existing room key sites, and then also making sure that those linkages stay whole when folks move on to their next housing setting. I think those are sort of the big pieces I wanted to touch on related to room key. I will just say that we appreciated hearing from the LA Coalition early on about the concerns that were raised, because I think one of the things that we can do in our position at the Department of Social Services is to do technical assistance with communities, to do problem solving with communities, to try to bring whatever IHSS resources we have to bear to help solve problems. So appreciate hearing early and often when you are identifying issues that happen at the community level. I just also wanted to lift up, while I have this sort of opportunity to speak with you, just make sure that folks are aware of some of the other work that's happening out of my department around our work to end and address homelessness. And the first is the HDAP program, the Housing Disability Advocacy Program. Again, this is a funding that flows through our Department of Social Services, but then goes to county departments of social services. And these are dollars that can be used, and I should say that not all communities avail themselves of these dollars, but many do. Over 25 counties do participate in the HDAP program, which means that they have resources that will allow them to do outreach, disability advocacy work, case management, as well as provide rental assistance and other housing assistance to people in their community. So this is a really valuable resource. We want to make sure that, again, like you said, Lisa, we've got resources. We want to make sure that we are taking advantage of them to the fullest. So I wanted you to make sure that that's all on everyone's radar, and it may already be, but lifting it up. And then the other is our program Home Safe, which is specifically for adults who are part of Adult Protective Services, which provides housing assistance as well, and is quite flexible in terms of especially how to prevent homelessness for people who are part of the Adult Protective Services program. So I am happy to take any questions that folks may have and continue the discussion.
Great. It looks like Karen Kiesler has her hand up, and then there's a few in the chat, but I'll call on Karen first. Karen, it looks like you're
Karen, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Really great speakers. Appreciate all of you. My question is on IHSS, and back in 2008, the state issued an all-county letter that really basically said that the counties cannot authorize IHSS for homeless consumers, with the citation that the statute says that IHSS is to be provided for people who are living safely at home, and that living under a bridge or along a creek is not considered safe. So I'm curious how that has been handled within the Project Home Key and sort of larger current homelessness, unsheltered population problem. I mean, I get it that when somebody's in Project Home Key that they would be in a room that the state would consider to be safe, but I assume there's some segment of the population that refuses to go into a home, or a room. So I'm curious whether that's been a barrier, if not, why not, and what kind of solutions can be applied?
Yeah, so IHSS services can be provided, like Lisa mentioned, in interim housing settings or shelter settings. So that would include Project Room Key sites. But that is currently the way that the regulations are laid out, is that it can be served in those interim settings, and that is sort of where it stands.
So if somebody does not accept Project Room Key, I just did a Joe Biden and named it the wrong thing, although I wasn't violent like Trump, so I get points for that. if somebody doesn't agree to go into Project Roomkey, then they don't get, then they wouldn't get home care services. Is that correct?
My understanding is that you have to be in a physical safe housing setting so that services can be provided in what's considered your own home. And that own home definition, again, it includes interim housing settings, but that's the limit of the definition.
Well, I just want to make a plug that I think that that's something that our policymakers, both the state and the legislature, should examine changing. If a homeless or unsheltered consumer can find a provider that would provide services for them under a freeway, then our regulations and laws ought not to be a barrier for them to receive personal care assistance.
I think that would likely expand access.
Corinne, this is Christina. Can you talk a little bit more? And I know Lisa had specifically talked about 2 sites, I believe that in LA, where there is, I believe, a personal assistant care provider that is assisting with multiple people within that motel. So in the case that Karen Kiesler is bringing up, where typically somebody who receives IHSS goes through an assessment process, while folks going into Project Roomkey are going through somewhat of an assessment process different than IHSS. It's not that they're necessarily getting assessed for IHSS in the same way that you would, correct? And therefore, that's why there's a shared caregiver at the motel providing the services that the person had activities of daily living needs with, right?
A little bit hesitant to speak for LA, but I can tell you what I understand to be happening. We may have to verify it with them, but is that they are basically doing what you could consider a patch until someone gets IHSS. So they're just using their local homelessness funding to be able to fund those personal care services ahead of an IHSS provider actually being able to do that. So we're missing the opportunity to use those IHSS dollars, but we sort of have to, because we have to be able to have a rapid solution to meet those needs right away. And so LA was like, we just have to figure out another way to do this so that we're not waiting. You can't wait for the IHSS process in a pandemic.
Thank you.
So I see Simon Pitchford, you had a couple comments that I was going to read, but your hand is raised. So why don't we go to you next?
Hi, everybody. Thank you. It's Simon Pitchford from Homebridge. So actually, I can address a couple of the questions. In San Francisco, we set up a system whereby there was a rapid IHSS assessment done for those individuals who were deemed potentially eligible for IHSS services, who might need help with their ADLs and IADLs. And so about 12% of the Project Roomkey population in San Francisco have been assessed. I think about 90% were successfully assessed for IHSS services, and we have provided those through Homebridge services at those sites. And again, as Lisa kind of intimated, it's typically one provider will provide services to multiple individuals within those hotel sites. So there is that has actually happened in San Francisco, is feasible. And to the earlier comment that Karen made, I think, again, part of this was in the Bay Area, we had already been thinking about the provision of services to homeless or newly housed individuals, and so had thought through some of the recommendations and shifts in the assessment process that would be needed to make that amenable, both in shelter settings and potentially in non-house settings. So we have a set of ideas and recommendations that we have shared with a number of folks. I think Lisa has a copy around ideas of how you could assess folks who are homeless and make available, maybe modified types of IHSS services. Just the other question for Corinne somewhat, if I may. One of the questions I asked was, you made a comment that Project Homekey is being run through the Housing and Community Development group rather than social services, and just a concern that we silo resources and decision making, and that the fear is that supportive services wouldn't get their due if it's under the housing, that most of the focus will go to the housing itself. And so just a slight concern as these things are moving under different organizations, that we maintain kind of all of the, I think it's really the collaborative efforts for not just housing, but all the support services that are needed to service this group of individuals and retain them in housing is really important. So I hope that doesn't get lost as the program moves between these different organizations. So
Yeah,
thank you, everybody.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great question and comment. I've been doing this work in supportive housing for about 15 years or so, and my mantra is you've got to have the affordable housing, but you've got to have the supportive services to be able to make it work. So you can't do one without the other. You've got to have both working together. So I appreciate the comment quite a lot. And the funding for Home Key is capital funding. And the reason that it's really sort of tied to capital funding is because it's coronavirus relief funds that must be used by December 31st, 2020. So this was using the dollars to support acquisition was a great way to be able to meet that really quite a fast funding timeline. And when any communities submitted applications to HCD to receive those capital dollars, they had to be able to outline a plan for providing both operating costs to administer the program as well as the supportive services. So they had to make a commitment to long-term deep affordability, to serve people experiencing homelessness, and to make sure that there are sufficient supportive services to be successful. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's great. And I think just a plug, our next webinar will be on Home Key. So we will transition. And so these are all really good questions and things for us to think about as we develop that panel. So thank you for that. And that's a really good point, Simon. And lots of, I'm sure, transition from your end between the two departments. So I'm going to call next on June Kales, and then we'll go down the list. I see a few people with their hands raised. June?
Yes, hi there. I think this question is for Corinne, primarily. How do we implement greater emphasis on the monitoring, the guidance, and the technical support? As Lisa said, signing compliance with ADA, with the REHAB Act, and other kinds of civil rights protections in the appendices don't really translate into equal access within some of these contracts. So, the guidance has to be more explicit. Good practices need to be quickly disseminated to the local jurisdictions in terms of, how can these existing tools be more flexibly applied? So how can FEMA, California, and DSS, the Housing and Community Development Agency, and the locals be more vigilant in applying the new lessons so that eventually we can really claim them as lessons learned? Because right now, I think we're still in the lessons to apply phase. So, Corinne, specific thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that Project Roomkey offers a good example of the importance of providing guidance early and often, and the importance of working with advocates like you all, and continuing to just push forward on a consistent emphasis on access and functional needs. So I think we have access and functional needs embedded in our Cal OES team as well, so we can continue to deepen our collaboration there as well.
Thanks, Fran. I think next in line we had Fran Smith. Fran, you want to go ahead?
I do. And it's so good to hear from Karen Kiesler about IHSS. I spent 17 years in one public authority and another public authority. And the assessment process has to be done because it's part of regulation. Assessment for IHSS, it's part of regulations. But there needs to be a rapid response way to do these assessments. It takes a while. In the public authority, we could not serve somebody until they had been enrolled in IHSS, and it takes all kinds of things. So if Homebridge can make this happen, it seems to me we have a model for how to proceed, but the will to do it. I was thinking at the last one of these webinars on the room key, I thought changing the IHSS regulations would take a huge amount of time. But if the governor would do an executive order and say, this is how I want you to proceed from now on, it might help. And I don't know if that's possible or not, but that's my comment.
Times moving things along more quickly than regulations can allow. Great. So let's go next to Greg Thompson.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. First, I want to congratulate everyone for all the excellent work they're doing. And I wanted to kind of circle back to Karen's question because I'm not sure I got an answer, but I wanted to ask it again. Are you and will you be considering working towards changing some of these regulations that are limiting people who are homeless or in institutions? It's kind of a catch-22. When I was a social worker and we were trying to discharge hospital patients, we couldn't apply for IHSS until they were discharged to a home. So we couldn't discharge them without a home. So it was just a circle. And in working with people experiencing homelessness, I met several people that actually function relatively well living on the street and choose to live on the street. And I think they could benefit from, changing that regulation and not being so limited and trying to get help to people that deserve it. Secondly, in Los Angeles, they've done a good job in creating an expedited IHSS application process. However, we're struggling with getting IHS workers to the various sites, and we're basically, trying to solve this problem with minimum wage people who are good workers, but they don't have training. So I'm hoping that, as we're doing in LA at a state level, you will continue to try to take advantage of this huge workforce. And there are many IHSS providers who are very eager for voluntary training. And I think providing them with the necessary tools would help. Going from a project room key to project home key, you need a higher level of, it's a different skill. You need somebody with some kind of case management skills. So I really hope that we would consider all of the different funding streams and how we can utilize that to offer better IHSS training and utilize that workforce. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. And I'll just note that Lisa did put in the chat that they recently formed an IHSS and homelessness task force in LA County that was modeled on the Bay Area task force to focus on how IHSS can be responsive to people experiencing and at risk of homelessness. So lots of good work going on and good to keep bringing it up. So I'm going to keep going down the line here. Looks like Justice and Aging is next.
Good morning. Hi, I wanted to also thank the panelists and Corinne for welcoming our advocacy push, and I really do appreciate the partnership that we have as well. I think we are really seeing, as Lisa mentioned, the convergence of homelessness issues, the need for healthcare and personal care assistance, assistance with activities with daily living, of people who are, temporarily housed, unhoused, and we want to make sure that there is this seamless transition. And I do think that existing programs can be maximized to create a lot of this, that we don't necessarily need a new program. And I was intrigued, Karen, by your comment about we can't do this. And I want to say that at least when somebody is in a shelter, a temporary motel room, or any other form of interim or temporary housing, there is no problem. And to point to Greg's problem that he identified of the catch-22, where you have to get the services in place before you can leave and you can't get them in place. I think that's exactly what the LA directive and guidance said, is you actually can get it in place so that the transition can be made. And there's provisions, and this may be a place where we can be thinking about how to be more proactive if there's a lesson to be learned, so that these systems are in place for the next disaster, which we know is coming. There is a provision in the Welfare and Institutions Code that directs every city and county.
I have a 1 hour guy. What?
That directs every city and county to update its emergency plan to talk about how IHSS will be provided during times of natural disaster. And it allows some flexibility around that, what is a home. And I think cities and counties can come up with emergency plans that will be responsive to all of the needs we've identified. And I'm wondering, Corin, if you could sort of say how you look at those emergency plans, or do you, or what agency does look at them for purposes of making sure that we're ready for this next disaster to deal with people who have those service needs?
Do you mean IHSS specifically, or more?
It is in the IHSS statute, but you raise a good question. Really, more broadly, all of the issues that Christina and June have raised around people with disabilities needing meaningful access in all different ways, programmatic, physical barriers. So take it away whichever way you'd like to go with it.
Well, so unfortunately on the IHSS side, it doesn't fall within my purview, so you may want to invite other folks from our department who are much more expert on the IHSS questions, unfortunately. I'm sure they'd be happy to come and participate in one of these sessions. I think thinking about how we prepare our system of care for people experiencing homelessness to be able to more robustly respond to emergencies is something that's a priority of our interagency collaboration. So through the work that we've been doing in responding to the pandemic, we've really deepened our relationship with local emergency response systems, continuums of care, and departments of social services, as well in this particular pandemic with departments of public health. So it's really about, from my perspective around serving people who are homeless, it's making sure that people who are homeless have access to all response efforts. That we don't necessarily need a separate response effort for people who are experiencing homelessness. Room key being an exception because of the fact that people are unhoused led to a very particular vulnerability. But otherwise, we want to make sure that people experiencing homelessness have the same access as everyone else to emergency response resources. And then just, helping communities to be prepared. And one of the things that was really a challenge for communities was standing up the Project Room Key efforts was just around staffing, having trained staff to be able to sort of mount this massive increase in resources across the state. Just to give you a sense of the sort of the scale of the work that happened, the over 15,000 hotel rooms that were brought on through Project Room Key represents a 50% increase in the number of shelter beds we have in California. So it wasn't an incremental change in the number of shelter beds, it was a 50% increase. So that required quite a lot of swift work on the part of counties, and one of the things that they brought to our attention was just how hard it was to staff up in particular, to hire people with competency in serving the people experiencing homelessness. So I think being prepared on the workforce front is an important priority in that work of being prepared to respond to crises when they occur. And we certainly saw this through this experience that we've got to be thinking about access early and often.
Thanks for that. And thanks for being the state representative of a very complicated issue that we know you don't have responsibility for all of it, but understanding.
But we have to we just do what we can, you know. We got to try to move the needle where we can, and it helps to have many others behind us and trying to make that change. So.
Awesome. So it looks like we have one more hand raised, and then we've got one more question from Christina, and then we'll wrap up. So Lenore McDonald, your hand's raised.
Yes. Hi, I'm Lenore. I'm with Center for Elders Independence. We're a PACE provider in Alameda County, and we are also an approved vendor for homelessness services with the county and have been involved in, we are a service provider in Project Room Key in the county. We've also been involved, the county was one of 4 that was involved in the 100-day challenge. And I want to suggest that the collaborative, when you do the home key project, get some debrief from this effort. It's been interesting. We've been actually, as you mentioned, you know, had to ramp up quickly and have been building an infrastructure for homelessness services in the county. And I think it would be valuable to hear some of the lessons learned. I'm hearing flavors of it in the comments that are coming out today. So I'd be happy to tee you up with an introduction to Robert Radner and some of his staff that have been behind that effort.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a terrific insights into this. IHSS, for instance, PACE is, we are able to include these home key room key sites are considered housed for the PACE program anyway. And we've had a lot of cooperation with the Department of Healthcare Services in entering and approving them for PACE. And as you know, PACE is a supportive model. It's healthcare and support services. But you're correct to assume we work with Abode, we work with Roots Community. There's a lot of a whole plethora of organizations involved in supporting these individuals in the meantime. And there was great concern about meeting ADL challenges in some of the sites. And one of the sites we serve, there's absolutely no handicap access. They're literally RV trailers, a whole site of more than 60 of them. And none of them have access. So there's a lot to be learned here. But overall, I think that you know, as we move forward, something else to consider is we've run across this in other programs too, is there's a CalFresh, believe it or not, requirement on CPUC broadband access grants and others where enrollment in these services is required for individuals to be able to access digital literacy access and other programs that would also, it'd be helpful to take a look at some of the restrictions that's placing on people too. Just as an aside, but please let's check in with the 100-day challenge group to see how things are going overall.
You know, I will say on the 100-day challenge, so just for folks who don't know, it's called a Rapid Results Institute model where 4 communities across the state were working with these outside consultants who helped to create rapid goals and plans to basically break barriers to get the work done. And I had the opportunity there were 3 sort of learning communities that were a part of the group where each of the counties got to report out on their work to date in a pretty meaningful way with a bunch of different state partners. So I actually did get a chance to hear from Alameda County and the other participating counties, each at 3 points during their 100-day challenge about what issues they had faced and what successes they'd had. So it was really cool to get to hear about the work that was happening, in particular through the 100-day challenge. Just the folks with the 100-day challenges were all focused on this rehousing effort out of Project Room Key. So how could communities quickly rehouse people in whatever housing settings were most appropriate for them? So it was cool. I'm glad you lifted it up. It was a really a great way for us also. Many of the state players, including HCD and others, participated in those learning communities where we got to hear what was happening. It was a really useful experience.
Great, we have just another minute left here, and I think maybe a nice way to round it out. Christina's got some questions about lessons learned. So why don't we wrap up with that question and then look for more information on our upcoming webinar about Project HomeKey. But Christina, I'll let you wrap it up.
Thanks, Athena. I do agree with Lenore that bringing in the 100-day challenge wrap up would be a great addition to a future agenda item. And our Modesto Independent Living Center was involved in that version of the challenge. So Corinne, and to Lenore's point, an entire RV park being made Project Room Key, and the state creating what you said is sort of the framework for the program to be implemented locally. That just makes me wonder, is the county, while you had the ADA legal language available in the framework, and we've seen it on the website, and to Lisa's point, that not really translating down for folks to understand what that really means. I think that what Lenore just pointed out is exactly why there's a need to talk more about than just what the ADA stands for and is. And this is really an equity issue for people with disabilities. And oftentimes when we talk about disability, for some reason, we always get captured into talking about the law instead of talking about us as humans needing as much equity and being underserved as other multi-marginalized communities. So I guess to that point, while I feel personally frustrated as a person with a physical disability and representing a statewide disability rights organization, I do have to ask, while you're providing the framework, what does the implementation and the basically is there any recourse on the counties, or not necessarily recourse, but how do the counties prove that they're following the guidance and making sure that they're implementing it in the most accessible way, programmatically and physically, for everyone to benefit from it? What does the state ask?
Yeah, I think it's really about you know, when issues arise, being there to help them problem solve, to provide proactive guidance, and you know, I think
monitoring. Is there any?
Not
how would that happen?
Not with this particular emergency response, but certainly with other, in part because when we're not the funder, we have a little bit less, our teeth are a little bit less sharp, but certainly happy to continue having the conversation to brainstorm and think through that. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I know we're just a few minutes over, and looks like a few people have dropped, but most people have stayed on. This has been such a great discussion, really interactive. We really appreciate you guys coming together on sort of short notice, and we will be sure to invite you back. And we really thank you for all of your insights, and more work to be done. And we'll all keep you know, everybody in the loop, and hope to see you all soon. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Athena.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.